It's the Extra Points Fantasy Football Show, the place where you receive expert fantasy advice for champions. With your host, NFL fantasy football expert, analyst, and draft scout, Lance Goodman. Hello, NFL football fans, fantasy football owners. Welcome back to the Extra Points Fantasy Football Show, the place where you get expert fantasy advice for champions. As always, I'm your host, NFL fantasy football expert, analyst, and draft scout, Lance Goodman. Let's go ahead and jump into another great show. But before we get into our first segment here, let me wish everybody out there happy holidays. We are a couple of days away from Christmas. A week later, we'll be screaming Happy New Year and over into 2026. And without question, it's been a great season for us here on the Extra Points Fantasy Football Show. Today, let's go ahead and knock out our final regular season ranking. So we know that the playoffs started a week ago. We still have another week or two, depending on how long your season extends out into week 17 or 18. So after the playoffs are over and after those championships are won, we'll do our year-end rankings, but let's go ahead now and break down our final regular season rankings, starting at the quarterback position. Once again, we know Buffalo Bills quarterback Josh Allen, Los Angeles Rams quarterback Matthew Stafford. Those two guys are the two main quarterbacks who led your team to a fantasy football successful season. Right behind them, we're talking about Drake May, Dak Prescott, Jalen Hurts, Jared Goff, Bo Nix, Justin Herbert, Trevor Lawrence, Caleb Williams rounding out our top 10. I think when you look at those guys, and we'll start with our top 5, Josh Allen, Matthew Stafford, Drake May, the most consistent. Jalen Hurts with his rushing touchdowns. I think you can loop him in right as well. Dak Prescott, Jared Goff, Bo Nix certainly had some monster games. May have struggled with consistency just a little bit, but when those guys were dialed in and putting up the big numbers, they were a huge impact to your fantasy football teams. And then I think when you look at Justin Herbert, Trevor Lawrence, Caleb Williams, consistent for the most part. I think when you look at Justin Herbert, Caleb Williams, those guys more on the front end and middle of the season. Trevor Lawrence of the Jacksonville Jaguars has certainly gotten hot late here, coming down the stretch run, taking advantage of some really favorable matchups on paper, and was dominant against a Denver Broncos defense last week. Let's move on to quarterbacks 11 through 20. We'll start with Jacoby Brissett of the Arizona Cardinals. Took over for Kyler Murray, had led the NFL since around week 8, averaging 308 passing yards per contest, had really been on fire until last week's game where he came back to life against the Atlanta Falcons. But for fantasy football owners who needed some help at the quarterback position or picked up a hot waiver wire grab, Jacoby Brissett from weeks, the middle of the season up until last week had been a very viable play and had actually worked his way into our top 5 to 10 fantasy rankings the last month of the season. Now let's take a look at some of the combination quarterbacks that you're seeing throughout the course of the season. We know that Brock Purdy of the San Francisco 49ers, Joe Burrow of the Cincinnati Bengals, both of those guys started the season in my top 10. Both of those guys were Cincinnati and the 49ers quarterbacks respectively, but injuries to both of those guys had them out for the majority of the first part of the season, or really the majority of the season. In their absence, it was Joe Flacco for the Cincinnati Bengals, who certainly had a stretch run where he was a top 5 to 10 fantasy quarterback. And we know Mac Jones, in replacement of Brock Purdy for the 49ers, did an excellent job and held it down for a lot of fantasy owners. So both of those guys in their starters' absences filled in admirably. And then Joe Burrow last week at Miami lit it up. Brock Purdy has been on fire the last couple weeks, dating back to his return game against the Arizona Cardinals. Now let's work our way down through the rest of the list. And throughout the course of the season, when you look at Jordan Love of the Green Bay Packers, Daniel Jones of the Indianapolis Colts, Sam Darnold, Baker Mayfield, I want to stop right there. Fantasy football is a season that has a bunch of seasons within it. So when you look at Daniel Jones, started off extremely hot. The same for Baker Mayfield. Daniel Jones slowed down around the middle of the season, ended up with an injury. He's out for the rest of the year. Baker Mayfield started off extremely hot, has cooled off immensely the last month and a half of the season. So if you were able to have those guys starting, maybe the first 4 weeks for Mayfield, the first 2 months for Daniel Jones, did a lot of great things for you. When you look at Sam Darnold, when you look at Jordan Love, those guys, when you had them in the right weeks, put up some monster numbers for your team. And then when we get down to Aaron Rodgers, Lamar Jackson, Patrick Mahomes, the same holds true. If you could catch them at the right time, they would put up the big numbers for you. And particularly, we know Lamar Jackson struggled with injuries, missed a lot of the season. Patrick Mahomes, inconsistent but steady. You had to really catch him at the right time. Aaron Rodgers is the guy that stands out on our list here because if you were able to catch him at the right time, and let's say you were in a 2-quarterback league, you suffered an injury maybe to a Brock Purdy, to a Joe Burrow, to a Kyler Murray, to a Lamar Jackson. Rodgers in the right games and situations was able to get you those 250 passing yards and 2 TDs that will certainly help steady your ship as long as you have the big playmakers surround you on the rest of your roster. Now let's go to our last batch of quarterbacks. And again, this is a perfect example of catching guys at the right time, right place. All of these guys were up and down. It just depended on their matchup in particular. And I think that holds true for Bryce Young of the Carolina Panthers. Had some great games this year. Other times had some horrible games this year. Jackson Dart, rookie of the New York Giants, by and large, when he was in the starting lineup, was very effective. Another guy that you picked up off the waiver wire who did some really good things for your team. But the last 2 weeks, or really last week against Minnesota, was hard to find. C.J. Stroud spent a good deal of time out injured, but in the right matchups, put up some big numbers for you. If you think back to his game at Baltimore, if you think about what he did against the Arizona Cardinals, same holds true for Michael Penix Jr. Had some really solid games for Atlanta, but was inconsistent. He ended with a season-ending injury. You look at Justin Fields of the New York Jets, got off to a nice start, but became shaky and untrustworthy and eventually benched and out of the lineup down the stretch. And then we already knew that guys like Geno Smith, Tua Tagovailoa, J.J. McCarthy, those guys were going to be inconsistent, spot play. You really had to catch them at the right time. And when you hear me talking about these quarterbacks, catching them at the right time, the right place, unless they're in that upper echelon of our top 10 to maybe 12, 13 quarterbacks, it may have been extremely difficult to catch them in the right game and situation because they're not trustworthy and not guys who are pegged in as starters. So unless you were in a franchise league, a super deep league, a 2-quarterback league, a super flex league where you could have 2 quarterbacks in your lineup, very unlikely that you were able to catch these guys, at least in normal fantasy football, maybe in daily fantasy or prop bets. And then as we get down to our bottom tier, we know that the quarterback situation in New Orleans, we know that rookie Cam Ward for Tennessee, we know that Dylan Gabriel and Shedeur Sanders for Cleveland. Neither one of those guys started. It was Joe Flacco. Been a revolving door there. And then probably one of your biggest disappointments outside of Lamar Jackson, outside of Kyler Murray this year, was going to be Jaden Daniels, quarterback of the Washington Commanders. Injuries kept him off the field the majority of the year. And he was a guy who was in our top 5 and a threat to Josh Allen to potentially take over that top spot. All right, we're going to run to a quick break. When we come back, it'll be more of the Extra Points Fantasy Football.
You boys want to call one?
Sure.
You know she meant the cake, right?
Okay, some things are meant to be silly, but choosing web interactive technologies to host your business online is like the opposite of silly.
They'll work with you and build your custom website.
And the search engine optimization? Finding your company will be... You get it.
As a business, you have to stand out. We're just pointing you in the right direction. Choose web interactive technologies. Don't be silly.
All right, NFL football fans, fantasy football owners, welcome back to the Extra Points Fantasy Football Show, the place where you've been getting expert fantasy advice for champions all year long. Once again, happy holidays to everyone as we are in the last 2 weeks of the year before we're heading over into 2026. Let's go ahead and jump back into our final regular season rankings. We're now focused on the running back position. And when we're talking about running backs, let's take a look at our top 10. And we're focused on consistency, PPR value, draft positioning, where you were able to land these guys. So we know Bijan Robinson of the Atlanta Falcons, Jahmyr Gibbs of the Detroit Lions, Christian McCaffrey of the San Francisco 49ers. All three of those guys been stellar all year long from start to ending. Sure, Robinson, Gibbs had a couple off games. I think McCaffrey's usage in the passing game overall and his ability just to get in the end zone probably made him the most consistent from beginning to end. But when you talk about Bijan Robinson, Jahmyr Gibbs, Christian McCaffrey, if you were able to surround those guys with the right pieces as far as your quarterback and wide receiver positions, without question, your team should have made the playoffs if they were able to stay healthy. So great job by those three. Now, when we talk about Jonathan Taylor, when we talk about Devon Achane, when we talk about James Cook, those three guys taken maybe in a little bit later, in mid-second round, third round, depending on some 10-man league. They might even been able to land James Cook at the top of the fourth. But if you look at the type of damage that those guys have done, especially if you were able to pair one of those guys up with Robinson, Gibbs, or McCaffrey, what a 1-2 punch you had at the running back position. So those top six guys right there, and Robinson, Gibbs, John Taylor, Christian McCaffrey, Devon Achane, James Cook, those guys were absolutely electrifying and amazing and pumped in the big fantasy football numbers for your team on a weekly basis, and that was without a doubt. Rounding out our top 10, other guys who were by and large very consistent, had a nose for the end zone. We're talking about Josh Jacobs of the Green Bay Packers. Javonte Williams of the Dallas Cowboys was a huge surprise, a guy you picked up later in your draft. Derrick Henry of the Baltimore Ravens, and then Saquon Barkley certainly was not what we expected from him this year in terms of his numbers overall. But if you go back and look for most days, he still was an intricate part of your team. And if you were able to get into the playoffs with him on your team, the last couple weeks, he's really starting to hit his stride heading into the playoffs. As again, we talk about that top 10, the biggest difference between Robinson, Gibbs, McCaffrey, Achane in particular, to a certain degree, Taylor and Cook. When you look at Josh Jacobs, Derrick Henry, Saquon Barkley, not involved in the passing game as those guys. That's the big difference. Javonte Williams, I probably would say you could loop him in as well. Certainly was able to be a guy a little bit under the radar, but certainly was able to be a part of that Dallas passing game. Let's move on to our running backs, 11 through 20. A lot to like here when you talk about Travis Etienne. Took over the full workload for that Jacksonville offense once they moved off of Tank Bigsby early in the season. Has done an outstanding job, really gotten back to form. If you remember a couple years ago when he got off to a really hot start, had a strong season, kind of flailed out at the end of the year due to injury, but this guy is super talented and is at the heart of that Jacksonville offense, also picking up steam with his receiving touchdown, which has been a huge lift to owners' lineups late in the season. Kyren Williams, although splitting the workload with Blake Corum, still over 1,100 rushing yards, double digits in TDs again. This guy is an absolute baller with that Los Angeles Rams offense. Chase Brown was one of our guys who we thought would be right exactly where he's at right now. Number 13 coming into the season. Can't remember, but if he wasn't in my initial top 10, was right on the cusp. The injury to Joe Burrow and the Bengals suspect offensive line kept Chase Brown in the shadows for the first part of the season. But if you look at what he's done the last 2 months, especially the last month, once Joe Burrow has gotten back into the fold, once Cincinnati had some better matchups on paper, Chase Brown has become a major player, and a guy, again, who in fantasy football, when some of your star players are struggling, if you've got enough quality depth, if you're using the waiver wire properly, if you got other pieces around you, if you can just get yourself into the dance, some of these guys have been a major player. And that certainly holds true for Travis Etienne for what he did in week 15 and what Chase Brown was able to do in week 16. Some later draft picks who certainly paid off big time when you talk about DeAndre Swift of the Chicago Bears, Jaylen Warren of the Pittsburgh Steelers, both of those guys respectively. Swift in week 15, Warren in week 16. Big games to help your fantasy football teams advance in the playoffs. Let's look at a couple of committees that went on throughout the course of the season where in a perfect world, if you started both Kenneth Walker III and Zach Charbonnet, if you had both of those guys in your lineups for the bulk of the season. What they did collectively in that Seattle backfield certainly was worthwhile. Marion Hampton found his stride when he went out. It was Kamani Vidal taking over the duties. Certainly was able to be a great waiver wire pickup, and the guy, a handcuff to Hampton, who paid big dividends in a lot of games while Hampton was trying to get himself back on the field. The same is going to hold true when you look at number 20 for J.K. Dobbins. Started off the year very strong. Once he went out with an injury, if you had the handcuff or were able to grab R.J. Harvey, he's been paying dividends. 11 touchdowns for the rookie. Very under the radar. Some nice quality value there. And then a couple other rookies who've been making it happen this year. When you look at Travion Henderson of the New England Patriots, although he's been in a committee the majority of the year, still has more rushing yards and rushing touchdowns than rookie Ashton Genty, who was drafted well ahead of him. And then we know that Quinshon Judkins, prior to his injury this last week, he's going to miss the remaining of the season with a dislocated ankle. He is certainly a guy who, for the bulk of the season, in the right situations, getting a full workload for Cleveland, who certainly paid big dividends as well. Now let's move on to our last batch of running backs. We just talked about Ashton Genty. I think the biggest failure on his part is just how high drafting platforms had him ranked. So you were taking him ahead of a Jonathan Taylor, a James Cook, a Kyron Williams, some running backs who are really more established and had better offenses around them overall. Nonetheless, Genty did show up big for owners who stuck with him and had them in their lineups in week 16, pumping in 43 big points in our NFL Explorer leagues. Let's talk about Cam Scatterbo, a guy who, again, when we talk about fantasy, a season within seasons, when he was a starter, took over for the New York Giants, certainly played a huge role in fantasy football owners' teams, picking up some wins before he went out with an injury. And then when you look at Rico Dowdell, Kenneth Gainwell, Kareem Hunt, all of those guys in their respective time and places had a role in your fantasy football teams being successful. We know that Breece Hall was really hit or miss, and just kind of the ship sunk there as the Jets season did as well. Look at some committees when you talk about Jordan Mason, Aaron Jones Sr. for Minnesota. If you could catch either one of those guys at the right place, the right time. We know that Bucky Irvin got off to a strong start, but missed a 2-month stretch in the season. If you were able to play your hand right, whether it was Sean Tucker and or Rachaad White, the guys who backed him up, there was certainly value there. We know that Tony Pollard is a guy, started off decent, hit a rough patch, had some nice games ending the season for owners who wanted to roll the dice on him. And then when we talk about inconsistency, you're talking about that Houston backfield with Nick Chubb, Woody Marks. There were certainly some good days, but more bad days. We know that James Conner was expected to have a big year for Arizona, went down early in the season. So you've been kind of trying to hold face and shuffle those Arizona running backs, whether it was Bam Knight or Michael Carter or Emari Demercado. Probably very hard to catch those guys at the right time. We knew it was going to be messy in Washington, but again, if you were able to capitalize, which probably was very difficult to do, but it was either rookie Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt or Chris Rodriguez. And then for the New Orleans Saints, we know that Alvin Kamara got off to a strong start, but by the time the middle of the season had come, injuries and just lackluster play wore him down. And then if you were able to pick up Devin Neal, the backup running back for the Saints, in some inopportune situations, he may have paid some dividends for your team as well. All right, that is going to wrap up that segment. When we come back, it'll be more of the Extra Points Fantasy Football Show, so don't you go in. NFL football fans, fantasy football owners, welcome back to the Extra Points. Let's go ahead and wrap up our show today by taking a look at our final regular season rankings for the wide receiver position. By and large, these are the names that you've been seeing all year long. Our guys rank 1 through 10. When you talk about Puka Nacua, Jackson Smith-Njigba, Amon-Ra St. Brown, George Pickens, all of those guys pumping in the big numbers for your fantasy football teams this year. Same holds true for Jamar Chase. Devonta Adams coming into week 17, leading the NFL with 14 receiving TDs, although he'll probably miss the remainder of the season with that hamstring injury. How about Chris Olave of the New Orleans Saints, a guy who was drafted later in rounds? A lot of question marks around him based on the inconsistent and inexperienced quarterback play out in New Orleans, but showed improved and ended up being one of the top value picks fantasy football owners in this year's draft. And then these last three guys on the list, I have them there because if they were not injured, if you look at their numbers, and we know that these guys are big-time playmakers, if these guys did not suffer injuries, I think they'd be right in that top 10 when you talk about Drake London of the Atlanta Falcons, CeeDee Lamb of the Dallas Cowboys, and Mike Evans of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. All of those guys proven, established commodities that usually put in the big numbers without question for fantasy football owners. Now let's move over to our guys ranked 11 through 20. When you talk about T. Higgins, A.J. Brown, Nico Collins, Cortland Sutton, Jameson Williams, Ted McMillan, Michael Wilson, Rashee Rice, and Zay Flowers, we knew that T. Higgins was going to be a big-time playmaker working opposite Jamar Chase. Struggled with injuries a little bit. We know that once Joe Burrow went out at quarterback, there was a stretch where Jake Browning was in, where both T. Higgins and Jamar Chase's numbers struggled. But once Joe Flacco got in that quarterback, things turned around, and T. Higgins continues to be a big-time playmaker. We know it took a while for A.J. Brown to get things going out in Philadelphia, but once he went and talked to management and got his voice out loud enough, he's been a trustworthy guy and been getting the big-time targets and producing the way that we know he can the last maybe month and a half of the season. Nico Collins struggled a little bit with quarterback play in Houston, but remains their top target and a trustworthy guy for your fantasy football team. Cortland Sutton had a really strong year out for Denver. Yes, there were some games where he went completely missing, but when you pull up his fantasy numbers, hard to argue what he's done, especially over the last 3 weeks where he's on a streak of 3 straight games with touchdown receptions. Another guy who took really long to get it going, Jameson Williams for the Detroit Lions, but once he got it going, man, it's been hard to stop him. He's been an excellent play for fantasy football owners who were able to sustain the slow start for him, or if owners got fed up and dropped him, if you picked him up off the waiver wire, what a late addition to your team that he's been. Ted McMillan should certainly be in the runnings for Offensive Rookie of the Year. Looks every part of what we thought he'd be out there with suspect play for the Carolina Panthers. How about Michael Wilson coming on late? But again, we talk about seasons within the season for fantasy football, and with the injuries to Marvin Harrison Jr., he became Jacoby Brissett's main target, and this guy has been an ultimate performer the rest of the season. Will be interesting to see if he can keep it up next year for Arizona, which would be a huge boost to their offense. We know Rashee Rice was going to miss the first 6 games of the season due to suspension, but when he came back, became the apple of quarterback Patrick Mahomes' eyes, averaged 18 plus points per contest. A big loss for a lot of fantasy football owners in week 16 with that injury. Zay Flowers certainly has been the main guy for the Baltimore Ravens offense in the passing game. The only issue that you ever have with him, which we see evidence again this year, just 2 receiving touchdowns, but certainly had his point of value based on where you're able to pick him up in drafts. And then Emeka Ibuka got off to a steaming hot start for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, was a guy who helped a lot of fantasy football owners the first quarter of the season get off to a very strong start. Now let's look at our next batch of guys. And I think when we talk about Devonta Smith of the Philadelphia Eagles, Jalen Waddle of the Miami Dolphins, DK Metcalf of the Pittsburgh Steelers, you know, Smith was probably the most consistent in terms of what you thought you'd get from him. Again, attached to the Philadelphia Eagles passing game that got off to a historically slow start. Jalen Waddle seen his numbers really take off after the injury to fellow wide receiver Tyreek Hill. DK Metcalf got off to a hot start, hit a very rough patch in the middle of the season, but the last couple weeks has come on strong. We know for Michael Pittman Jr. and Stephon Diggs, it's been kind of the similar situation where Pittman Jr. got to a really hot start, has really struggled coming down the stretch, kind of the opposite for Stephon Diggs, which we expected coming off the ACL injury from last year. Took a while for him to get it going, but once he did, was hot for a stretch, cooled off, came back and had a big game for owners in week 16. When you move over to Ladd McConkey, Quentin Johnson, DJ Moore, Rome Odunze. McConkey and Johnston, the receivers for the Chargers. Moore and Odunze, the receivers for the Bears. If those quarterbacks in Justin Herbert and Caleb Williams strictly focus on making those guys the only priority in the passing game for those offenses, their numbers would be much higher. But those offenses spread the ball around a lot, which made it hard for those guys to trust. Nonetheless, Rome Odunze and Quentin Johnston got off to extremely hot starts. Ladd McConkey, about the middle of the season, became much more consistent and trustworthy. DJ Moore is the guy who got really spotty and hard to trust, but with Odunze being out of the lineup the last couple weeks, has really come on strong. And then Khalil Shakur. This is a guy to me right now for the Buffalo Bills who, again, has been consistent enough considering the Bills truly don't have a number one receiver. So when we kind of looked at that last batch of receivers here, when we were talking about starting with Devonta Smith all the way down to Khalil Shakur, this was really not about talent. It was more about inconsistency and trust issues due to the results that we've seen in regards to those guys' performances on the football field. But all of those guys, under the right circumstances and situations with a heavy amount of targets, don't get me wrong, can be very productive in the NFL. Now let's move on to our next batch of guys here when we're talking about, look, Tyreek Hill, Malik Neighbors, both of those guys had season-ending injuries. We were expecting them to be inside of our top 10 to 20 receivers for sure. Justin Jefferson, Marvin Harrison Jr. We knew Justin Jefferson was going to be risky with a young quarterback like J.J. McCarthy. Marvin Harrison Jr. struggled with injuries this year and some inconsistent play. You know, the same holds true for Juwan Jennings of the San Francisco 49ers. Injured to start the year, in and out of the lineup, but now he's back healthy. You see him be very productive, really in that 49ers lineup all year when he's been 100%. Wan'Dale Robinson, a guy that we did not expect to see on our list, but I think if you look at what happened with Malik Neighbors going out, Wan'Dale Robinson became the most trustworthy target in that offense. And then when you talk about receivers in Washington with Terry McLaurin, Deebo Samuel, injuries were a huge part of McLaurin's low numbers this year. And then they lost their starting quarterback, Jaden Daniels, which had a profound effect on their numbers. And then for Brian Thomas Jr. and Jacoby Myers for the Jacksonville Jaguars, both of those guys struggle with inconsistency. Thomas due to injuries. Myers started off in Vegas. I think that's a tandem that we need to really keep our eyes on for next season. And then when we get to our last batch of guys here, Garrett Wilson, another guy that if it weren't for injuries and inconsistent quarterback play, we'd expect to see his numbers higher. And then if you could catch these players here at the right place, at the right time, they could certainly help your fantasy football teams when we split the season up into quarters and frames. So we want to give an honorable mention to Troy Franklin, Keenan Allen, Romeo Doubs, and Christian Watson, that combination in Green Bay. Alec Pierce just had a 2-touchdown reception game in Week 16 against San Francisco. Kendrick Bourne had a couple of games. Rashid Shaheed time split in New Orleans to start finishing in Seattle. And Jordan Addison, all of those guys, if you had them in your lineups at the right time, they certainly paid dividends for your team at some point during the season. All right, that is going to wrap up our segment for today. Please make sure to check me out on social media, on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram. Everybody have a Merry Christmas, and we'll see you again next week here on the Fantasy Football Show, the place where you get expert fantasy advice for champions. Let's go.